This day is given to us beyond anything we could create or earn, whether deserved or undeserved. This day comes to us as a gift from the universe, a gift from God, a gift from life itself. So come and let us worship with gratitude for this and so many gifts, with humility for our shortcomings, resilience to face the challenges ahead, and let us worship with hope that we will continue to transform our lives and to transform our world. Let's sing, gathered here.
Gathered here in the mystery of the hour,
Well, good morning, and welcome to our virtual worship service at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. I'm Reverend Eric Poza, interim minister, joined by our senior minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan, music director Lee Hartman on piano, Robin Mulder in the tech deck, and our director of family ministries, Kathy Smith, running the chat. For those of you watching this live on YouTube, there is much happening in this congregation. We may have, again, temporarily closed the building, but the church is still open, and it is temporary. Once the case numbers in East Baton Rouge Parish drop below 25 cases per 100,000, then we will be reopening the sanctuary for Sunday morning worship, and they've been on their way down for a few weeks now. They're below 50, so we're hoping that will happen soon. Now, there is a lot that is happening in the life of the congregation, be the building open or not. For example, 3 weeks from today is going to be an annual tradition of this church, the blues service. So we hope you'll join us in person or virtually for that. We do have an event coming up later next month. On March 19th, we'll be doing a workshop on the 8th principle with Paula Cole-Jones. Coming for that, and I'll actually say more about that in the sermon later in this worship service. And of course, on the first Sunday of April, in the afternoon, we have a tradition for when a new minister, in this case, our newly called as senior minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan, joins a congregation. That's the installation service. So that will be at 4 p.m. on April 3rd, I believe is the date of the Sunday. So we hope you'll join us for all of those. Now, a note about the lesson coming up in just a few seconds. We have something to share from actually a colleague of mine who made it available to this congregation with much appreciation to the Reverend Kimberly Debus for the offering of this lesson that fit so well with the theme of today's worship service.
Many Rivers to the Sea, adapted from the story Many Paths to God, from the book Hide and Seek with God by Mary Ann Moore. Once upon a time, 4 travelers from different places met on a mountain overlooking the land. These travelers had been told that if they followed the rivers that flowed from the mountain, they would find God. Along the road, there were many rivers to choose from. The travelers had each been told which river to follow, but also that only their path would bring them to God. The first traveler said, "I have been told that the right river is the one with the lush banks of flowers, and if I follow the flowery path, I will find God, the great mother of all." The second traveler said, "Well, I have been told that the right river is the one with rocky crags and rapids, and if I follow the rocky path, I will find God, the great Father in heaven." The third traveler said, "I have been told that the right river is the one that goes into the deep woods, and if I follow the forest path, I will find God, the great peaceful silence." The fourth traveler said, "I have been told that the right river is the one that passes by tall buildings and long sidewalks, and if I follow the paved path, I will find God, the great Spirit in all things." The travelers were surprised to hear about the other paths because they were sure that the river that they had been told to follow was the right one. They each tried to convince the other to follow their way, but none would change. So bidding each other goodbye, they began their journeys. As the first traveler started toward the flowery river, they sang a simple song. "Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going?" The second traveler started toward the rocky river and sang their simple song. "Where do we come from?" The third traveler headed out on the tree-lined river and began singing, "Where do we come from? Where are we going?" And the fourth traveler started down the sidewalk next to the urban river and sang, "Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery." As the travelers walked, they could hear each other's songs in the distance, and they thought to themselves how very strange those other songs sound. Soon they were traveling alone and could no longer hear any of the others. Sometimes following the river was easy, and sometimes it was hard. Finally, each of the travelers neared the shores of the ocean. They began to hear those other travelers' songs, but now they said to themselves, "I didn't realize how beautiful they are." All four came to the shore within minutes of each other. They stopped and eagerly looked around. The first called out, "Oh, great mother of all, I have found you." And the second called out, "Oh, great Father in heaven, I have found you." The third called out, "Oh, great peaceful silence, I have found you." And the fourth called out, "Oh, great Spirit in all things, I have found you." But as they heard one another, they realized they were all singing and calling out to the same God. Then they realized that each of their paths was an important part of the journey, and that the things they saw were just as important as the things others saw, both on the path and in their God. And soon they started singing together. The first traveler, who had followed the flowery path, started their song. "Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And then the second traveler, who had followed the rocky path, joined in. "Where are we going? Where do what are we come from? Where do we come?" And then the third traveler, who followed the forest path, joined their voice. "Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where come from?" And the fourth, who had followed along the paved urban path. "Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. And they realized their songs were just one piece of a bigger song of humanity. And when sung together, they make beautiful music. Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery.
Yesterday at about this time, we had a memorial service for a longtime member of this church, Tom Haney. So just to know that this weekend we're holding him and his family in our thoughts. You can watch that, actually. It was streamed, so you can, if you missed it, you can watch it. This ritual we have, you can do in person at 11:30, or you can do right now online. And once we're open again, do it in person. Invite you to type into the chat whatever's on your heart, whatever's on your mind. We normally would have you come forward, take a stone, place it in the chalice bowl. I'll do that in your absence. I now invite you to come forward, those who wish, as we place stones. And would you light your chalices at home as we say together, with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is a symbol of the power of love.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung, through every land, by every tongue.
Well, we are approaching Mardi Gras season. Now, I clearly have limited exposure to Mardi Gras culture as one who's been in southern Louisiana a grand total of 2 years, the 2 times that I've lived here. But there's one piece that has recently intrigued me, and it's how many of the classic Mardi Gras songs say something about rivers. Is this because New Orleans is a river city? Well, then again, lots of cities and towns in Acadiana have pretty strong Mardi Gras traditions as well, and they're not all on rivers. Nevertheless, and for whatever reason, there are a number of songs in the Mardi Gras canon with lyrics that emphasize this metaphor of the river. Now, I'll say more about Mardi Gras itself in 2 weeks on the Sunday just before then. Today, I want to offer a little different kind of reflection inspired by an aspect of our lead up to that season. Over the last several months, you may have noticed that we've been sharing the same song for a few Sundays in a row. It's a way of offering some thematic consistency for the time of year, the season in the life of the congregation that we're in at the time. So starting today and continuing through Mardi Gras, that song will be one of the river songs, if you will, Shall We Gather at the River. You'll hear it later in this service. And its metaphors of the river and also of gathering have much to say to us. At the same time, I have to own that for me, this is a song that has a different connotation. And it's a connotation connected actually to a different UU congregation. Now, I know that talking about another church can be awkward, but I believe there's something for us to be gained by looking at 2 contrasting experiences of this other congregation, one of which was enriching and the other, well, sobering. That may help us unpack this symbolism of the river and the deeper meaning of gathering. Now, the church I'm talking about is so closely associated with the river, that's actually on the church sign, the Church of the River. I served there 5 or 6 years ago as interim minister. Its official name is First Unitarian Church of Memphis, but everyone in Memphis, not just in the church, calls it Church of the River. Imagine a building in which you enter the sanctuary from the back and you find that it's built on a hill. There are descending steps with each pew 2 steps lower than the one immediately behind it, going down to the floor many steps below, and the front wall that you would be facing as you were sitting in the sanctuary has 2/3 of it completely taken up by floor-to-ceiling window panes with no breaks in them between floor to ceiling, no supports breaking the glass, that overlook the Mississippi River, which is no more than 75 yards away. And I understand the windows are 14 feet tall. The other third of the front has an elevated pulpit in which I got eventually used to climbing up into each Sunday, though that was a rather surreal experience. The building was designed by a church member who was a prominent architect in the area, with encouragement from their minister at the time. This was in the mid-1960s, the Reverend Dr. James Madison Barr III. Remember that name. You're going to hear it again, James Madison Barr III. Well, it's no surprise that the river became an important symbol to the congregation over time. There are even some religious conservatives in the community, and in this case, I think religious reactionaries is an appropriate term, who even accused the church of worshiping the Mississippi River. Well, as absurd as that is, it's still true that in their prospective member classes, they did speak about the river and what it had come to symbolize for them, a symbol of life and a symbol of the flow of time, one that recognizes change as part of reality. And I did mention that later in the service, and for the next 2 weeks, we'll hear the same anthem, Shall We Gather at the River? Well, this is a congregation that had a tradition of holding an in-gathering service at the beginning of each church year. And at each annual in-gathering service every year, the choir had developed a tradition of singing as its anthem, you guessed it, Shall We Gather at the River? For the Church of the River, it was a fairly obvious choice for in-gathering service. And it showed that gathering, that togetherness, that the experience of community is also an important value for them. Now, again, if it seems that I'm inappropriately singing the praises of a church in another state, please understand that all of what I've just shared gives me context, actually gives important contrast to another story, one that has a very different tone and a different subject. That's also woven into the fabric of life at the Church of the River. And I'll share that story after this reading, which offers some surprising contrast, some surprising context for the story I'll share afterwards.
Last week in worship, we heard a reading from this book, The Selma Awakening, by Mark Morrison Reed, Unitarian Universalist historian. Another passage from the same book illustrates another aspect of the complexities and hesitancies that we experienced during the Civil Rights era among Unitarians, among Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists. He writes, researchers today find it difficult to document resistance to integration because neither congregations nor ministers will admit they opposed civil rights. Yet there can be no doubt there was division, if not about the goal, then about the means and pace of getting there. Any resistance had to be subtle, masquerading at sometimes as indifference or denial, at others as caution or skepticism. Flight was another response. In 1948, following Homer Jack's first sermon at the Unitarian Church of Evanston, Illinois, a member approached Jack and told him that he was too radical and that the member would quietly leave. That member was W. Clement Stone, the billionaire insurance magnate. It is impossible to document how many others quietly slipped away.
People quietly slipped away from our churches when faced with challenges to the racial status quo. It happened during the civil rights era of the mid-20th century, and it's surely still happening. Recall that in last week's sermon, our senior minister clarified reasons for this church to support the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Now, I've said before that Unitarian Universalism is shifting theologically in recent years from a simplistic and occasionally stereotypical manifestation of liberal religion to embodying a theology of liberation. This is the direction in which the flowing river of our freely covenanted UU faith is flowing. And this principle gives clear voice to that flow, to that change. But it's not just that some people are going gently into that bad night of their own unchallenged prejudices. There are also some who are raging against the dying lights of their own privilege and the culture that bolsters their supremacy. There have been a few obnoxious examples in other UU churches attempting to disrupt their eighth principle discernment. I'm not talking about everyone who's raised questions or concerns, but about some who have just simply been obstructionist. But frankly, that kind of phenomenon is not new. So what can reflecting on a history of engagement with past struggles to dismantle racism, the triumphs of those struggles, and their painful shortcomings, if you will, at least their painful stumbling blocks and obstacles, what can such reflection tell us about ourselves? Well, that question brings me back to Mark Morrison Reed's book on Selma. From the paragraph that immediately followed his comment about people quietly slipping away, he wrote, Reverend James Madison Barr III represented an exception. He was not quiet, did not slip away, ardently opposed the demonstrations in Selma, and regularly received letters from his colleagues castigating his position. The UU minister in Memphis in 1965 ardently opposed the demonstrations in Selma. And that's not all. Barr supported a bill that allowed housing segregation. He responded to Reeb's death by suggesting that Martin Luther King Jr. and the other leaders of the civil rights movement were in some part to blame for it because supposedly they created the conditions under which it happened. And if that's not infuriating enough, on the Sunday following Martin Luther King's death, Barr stood in the pulpit just 1.5 miles from where the shooting occurred and implied in different words, but clearly conveying the message that King, in his opinion, had it coming. This happened years before I was born, and I'm still angry about it. But rather than convey that anger when I served that congregation, what I did when I preached about this at the Church of the River 6 years ago, knowing that there were many members who still remembered their late minister fondly, I noted that good people miss the mark, and we do a disservice to them and to ourselves to cast a blind eye to their errors. It's important to note how good a minister Reverend Barr was for the Church of the River in many ways, and on this key social issue, which resonated so deeply with the values and the principles of Unitarian Universalism, James Madison Barr was simply wrong about civil rights. He was wrong about Martin Luther King Jr. Well, Jim Barr's story is an outlier, but it is illustrative. What, though, does it say to us today? Well, we'll get there soon, rest assured. First, let's sing a hymn about finding peace and justice, well, down by the riverside.
Come lay down on sword and shield, down by
going to talk for a minute only to get us from the high hymn into a prayerful state. Last night I went to my first parade for the first time in 2 years. It was a very strange feeling. There was a lot of celebration with kind of an undercurrent of what we've been going through. Sort of like the undercurrent in that hymn, right? The upbeat with the with a sort of exasperated sad underneath. So with that, I'll ask you to join me in a moment of prayer and reflection as we start to transition into the deeper part of the service. The God that we know when we see joy and celebration and hope, be with us on this day. That mystery believed in, named and unnamed. Gather with us together here. And hold all those who need to be together, who need to feel connected, who need to feel loved. And hold all those who feel set apart, who feel separated, who feel alone. All of those who have made bold statements that sometimes were wrong. All who need to be reconciled with each other and with the world. Hold all of us as one gathered community, imperfect, striving towards goodness. Help us to be okay with our failings and to work to make them better. Help us to be okay being alone and help us to be together. Help us to celebrate this life that we've been given. And help us to be beacons of peace and of love and of justice. Amen.
I saw in Louisiana a live oak growing. All alone stood it, and the moss hung down from the branches without any companion. It grew there, uttering joyous leaves of dark green, and its look, rude, unbending, lusty, made me think of myself. But I wondered how it could utter joyous leaves, standing alone, there without its friend near, for I knew I could not. And I broke off a twig with a certain number of leaves upon it, and twined it around a little moss, and brought it away. And I have placed it in sight in my room. It is not needed to remind me as of my own dear friends, for I believe lately I think of little else than of them. Yet it remains to me a curious token. It makes me think of manly love, for all that, and though the live oak glistens there in Louisiana, solitary in a wide, flat space, uttering joyous leaves all its life, without a friend, a lover near, I know very well I could not.
The last image you saw in that reading was of Walt Whitman and of Peter Doyle, Whitman's lifelong friend and probably partner. Historians have not found definitive evidence of that, but the circumstantial evidence is relatively clear. The thing is about that poem that struck me is how Whitman spoke about his not being able to be without his friends, without his lover. I also found it compelling that he used a live oak standing alone as his symbol, a symbol of a kind of individuality that Whitman seemed to admire, but also fully recognized was not for him, because the community of those with whom he was in relationship was far more important. And I admit I'm also struck by the fact that he chose a symbol that he found in Louisiana, a place where there is a collective culture that speaks against the kind of individuality, or at least offers an alternative to it for many people. But I was reminded of that kind of individuality and how it can be taken to an extreme when I remembered the story about James Madison Barr. Mark Morrison Reed's book goes on to say about Barr, he was a self-proclaimed Jeffersonian who considered limiting the power of the federal government to be of paramount importance, and protested whenever he thought it violated the rights of the individual or the state government, and added, he represents a strain of exaggerated individualism to which Unitarian Universalism is prone. Now, I think it's getting less true in recent years, but there is certainly still truth to the claim that UUism is, and especially has been, prone to that exaggerated individualism. And we could offer an entire sermon or more tracing that back through our religious history. But I'm also struck how that commitment to freedom, in this case the freedom to discriminate, that Barr advocated for, and that commitment to individualism is toxic. And it has an impact on those around the people proclaiming it that can take a long time to overcome. And the Church of the River, which in recent years has done wonderful work on this subject, did have a period of its time in its history when it didn't really talk, at least amongst itself collectively, about the impact of these threads of Reverend Dr. Barr's thought and the messages that he preached and advocated for. It was good to see them start that work, which I understand continues today. And it reminds me that this work of following the river, if you will, to borrow the metaphor from our lesson, following the river to truth, be it truth about God, be it truth about racial equity and racism in our country, means accounting for the truth. That work of accounting, that work of accountability is not always easy, but there is much to be gained from it, and I'll conclude in a few minutes to say more about that.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angel feet have trod, with its crystal tide forever flowing by the throne of God? Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. On the margin of the river, washing up in silver spray, we will walk and worship ever all the happy golden day. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. of peace. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God.
So this month we are, let's see if I step back. Nope, that makes it worse. There we go. So this month we are going to be sharing our offering with the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. I'm going to make this mic work. There we go. How's that? Real in-time camera adjustment. So we're going to be sharing our offering with Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. This is a group of Black UU leaders from all over the country who have basically created an organization that supports Black Unitarian Universalists. Because not every Black UU needs this level of support, but many do. So the whole month of February, we are sharing the offering with Blue. That's BLUU. So we'll ask you to give very generously as this morning's offering is now given and received.
We gather in, as I've said, so many ways, as we worship together, as we come together as church, to be church and to do church. And the gathering equips us at its best, and sometimes more often than we realize, equips us to overcome so many of these barriers, stumbling blocks that we face. And for me, that's the meaning of gathering. I'm reminded of how it's put into words by my friend and colleague, Reverend Joanne Fontaine Crawford, who speaks of being gathered and sent as a congregation. In her words, we gather to strengthen our spirits. We are sent out then to strengthen the world. Our gathering around this work and engaging this anti-racism work, including but not limited to this discernment around the eighth principle, is work that is often seen by many people, and primarily I mean many white people. Well, the analogy that comes to mind, frankly, is how I tend to view workouts at the gym. It's grueling, it's an exhausting set of exercises that doesn't feel good in the moment. And even when I recognize the good they can do long term, I may quietly think it's not worth the effort. And yet it is worth the effort. Because instead of that view, instead of that frame, if you will, we can see this work of discerning how we can, again, to quote the eighth principle, work to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. We can see that work as spirit-strengthening work the kind of spirit strengthening for which we gather. Gather virtually, gather in person, or both. And it can strengthen us to acknowledge these flowing rivers of cultural change that have been leading us towards this sea of truth, this sea of justice, the sea of beloved community, as articulated in the 8th principle. It can strengthen us to follow their flowing waters and avoid the dangerous currents. And there are particular ways we can do this. This congregation has done it in the past through its beloved conversations. The opportunity coming up for us next month is on Saturday, March 19th, on which we'll gather for a virtual workshop led by the Unitarian Universalist anti-racism trainer Paula Cole Jones out of Washington, D.C. And it's work that can be talked about in the future. Should this congregation vote, as I personally hope it will, to endorse the 8th principle, that's not the end of the work. And I'll be excited, even after I end my own service here, to watch from a distance and see how that work continues to play out here at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. When we gather to follow the river, when we sing our songs together, the way we heard in that lesson, while we're following the motion that leads us towards the seas we're seeking, that coming together does indeed strengthen us in ways that empower us to go out and strengthen the world, because we've already strengthened our own faith community in the process. The work is worth the effort. The gathering is joy in itself, and the steps along the journey send us further out into the world that we would strengthen. So let's take one more step together. So may it be. Amen. Let's sing. And so, as we go forth from this sacred time, from these many sacred spaces on which we gather, may we go forth knowing ourselves to be blessed with freedom, blessed with wholeness. For though our worship now ends, our service begins anew. Let's go forth and serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Thank you for joining us. Go in peace.